I've always wondered if my life would have turned out differently had I not stepped into that diner 15 years ago. I was 25, broke, and terrified. I had a 2-year-old strapped to my hip and no one to call. It was one of those places you drive past without thinking much about, a peeling sign with mismatched lettering, a flickering neon, open, light, and the smell of fried onions lingering in the air. It wasn't much, but that diner saved me. I became a waitress because I had no other choice. My high school diploma wasn't worth much, and no one was hiring someone with no experience and a kid. But at the diner, they didn't care. Betty, the owner, looked me up and down, sighed, and said, "You start tomorrow. Wear comfortable shoes." That was the beginning of everything. Or maybe it was just another chapter of scraping by. Either way, it became my world. Every morning, I pulled my hair back into a ponytail, tied on my apron, and started pouring coffee before the sun was fully up. I learned to balance plates on my arms, smile through rude comments, and dodge the cook's temper when the grill got backed up. My feet ached so badly at the end of each day that I had to soak them in ice water. But every dollar I earned was for MIA. MIA was the reason I kept going. Her laugh, her crooked smile, the way she'd wrap her little arms around my neck and say, "You're the best, Mommy." That was enough to make the long hours bearable. We lived in a tiny apartment, the kind where you could hear the neighbors fighting through the walls. But it was ours. I made it ours. At night, after putting MIA to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a calculator, trying to stretch my paycheck far enough to cover everything. Some weeks it worked, some weeks it didn't, but I never let MIA see me cry. I wanted her to believe everything was okay, even when I wasn't sure it would be. The years blurred together. I worked every holiday, every weekend, every snowstorm. I made friends with the regulars, the truckers who tipped generously, and the elderly couples who split a single plate of pancakes. They became part of my life, little anchors of familiarity in an otherwise chaotic existence. MIA grew up in that diner. Betty let me bring her along when I couldn't find a babysitter. She'd sit in a booth with a coloring book and crayons, her legs swinging as she hummed to herself. The customers adored her. They'd slip her quarters for the gumball machine or hand her leftover biscuits. "She's gonna be something special," they'd say, and I believed them. MIA was smart. So much smarter than me. By the time she was in middle school, I could barely keep up with her homework. She'd sit at the kitchen table, her head bent over a textbook, while I reheated leftovers from the diner. Sometimes, she'd look up and ask, "Mom, how do you spell mitochondria?" I'd laugh and say, "You're asking the wrong person, kiddo." I didn't know much about biology or geometry, but I knew how to work, and I made sure MIA saw that. I wanted her to understand the value of effort, the importance of perseverance. I wanted her to see that anything was possible if you tried hard enough. But deep down, I was afraid. I was afraid she'd see me as a warning, not an example, a reminder of what happens when you make the wrong choices or don't plan your life carefully enough. I didn't want her to end up like me, stuck in a job that wore you down to the bone, with no time or energy to chase your own dreams. That's why I poured everything I had into her education. I worked double shifts to afford school supplies, tutored her in math even though I didn't fully understand it myself, and scrimped and saved for her future. Every penny I put into her savings account felt like a victory. I told myself it would all be worth it when MIA walked across that stage in a cap and gown. The day she graduated high school, I felt like I was floating. She was radiant in her navy blue robe, her smile lighting up the entire auditorium. When her name was called, I clapped so hard my hands stung. This was it. This was proof that all the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, and the aching feet hadn't been in vain. MIA was on her way to something better. After the ceremony, we went out for ice cream. It was a rare indulgence, but I didn't care. I wanted her to have something sweet, something special to mark the occasion. We sat on a bench outside the shop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. MIA licked her cone thoughtfully, then looked at me with those big brown eyes of hers. "Mom," she said, "I'm going to make you proud." "You already have," I replied, my voice catching in my throat. But even as I said it, I felt a strange pang in my chest. Pride, yes, but also fear, because deep down, I knew the day was coming when she wouldn't need me anymore. And I wasn't sure who I'd be without her. After Mia's high school graduation, life changed, but not in the way I had hoped. She had been accepted to a good college, one with a reputation that made me swell with pride just saying its name. But pride couldn't pay tuition. No matter how hard I worked or how much I saved, I couldn't close the gap. She was determined to go, though, and I couldn't blame her. She'd earned it. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the financial aid forms. The numbers didn't add up. No matter how many times I recalculated, I couldn't let her know how dire it was. She had already gotten a part-time job at the campus library to help cover expenses. She'd even taken out loans in her name, something I had promised myself I'd never let her do. But it still wasn't enough. I started taking double shifts at the diner, sometimes working 15 hours straight. My boss, Betty, gave me a sympathetic look when I asked for more hours. "You sure you can handle it, Laura?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. Those months were some of the hardest of my life. I'd wake up before dawn, pack Mia's care packages of snacks and toiletries, and head to the diner. By the time I got home, it was dark, and my legs felt like lead. My nights were spent paying bills and sorting through my tip money, trying to stretch it far enough to make ends meet. MIA had been my anchor, my reason to keep going. But once she went to college, everything felt different. The house was too quiet without her. I missed the sound of her music drifting from her bedroom, her laughter over some silly meme she'd found, even her complaints about how I folded her laundry. At first, she called every day. Her voice was bright and full of excitement as she told me about her classes and her new friends. She sent me photos of the campus, autumn leaves carpeting the sidewalks, the tall stone library she loved, the tiny dorm room she'd made her own with string lights and posters. But as the months passed, the calls became less frequent. Her texts, once filled with emojis and inside jokes, turned into short, polite replies, "Busy with homework. Love you, Mom." I told myself it was normal, that she was just busy adjusting to her new life. Still, it hurt. One day, she invited me to visit her on campus. I was nervous, unsure of how I'd fit into her world. When I arrived, she gave me a quick hug before leading me around. The campus was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. I saw the way her friends looked at me, their smiles kind but distant. They didn't know what it was like to wake up at 4 a.m. to make rent or to carry the weight of someone else's future on your shoulders. We went to lunch in the student union. She ordered a salad. I chose a burger. As we ate, she talked about her plans, internships, study abroad programs, grad school. I nodded and smiled, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far away she seemed. She was slipping into a life I had only dreamed of, and I didn't know how to keep up. Back home, the loneliness became unbearable. I threw myself into work, partly to distract myself and partly because the bills hadn't stopped coming. Tuition payments loomed over me like a dark cloud. No matter how much I worked, it never felt like enough. One night, after a particularly grueling double shift, I came home to a voicemail from MIA. She was apologetic, explaining that she couldn't come home for Thanksgiving because of a group project. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about the distance that had grown between us, a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. I started to feel invisible. At the diner, I was just another waitress, blending into the background as customers scrolled through their phones or talked over me. At home, I was a ghost, wandering through empty rooms filled with memories. Even Mia's care packages filled with her favorite snacks, handwritten notes, and little surprises began to feel like a futile effort to hold on to something slipping away. Then came the day that broke me. I got a letter from the college financial office. They needed an additional payment to cover Mia's tuition, one I couldn't possibly afford. I tried everything, borrowing from friends, negotiating with the school, even looking into payday loans. Nothing worked. When I called MIA to tell her, she was calm and understanding, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "It's okay, Mom," she said. "I'll figure something out." But it wasn't okay. It felt like I had failed her. Failed the one thing I had worked so hard for. I didn't stop working, though. I couldn't. I kept going, day after day, because that's what you do when you have no other choice. The diner became my whole world again, a familiar grind that offered little comfort. The regulars noticed I wasn't myself. "You okay, Hon?" one of them asked. I smiled and nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure I'd ever be okay again. When MIA graduated college, I should have felt proud. And I did, in a way. She stood on that stage in her cap and gown, her smile radiant, just like it had been at her high school graduation. But this time, I felt like an outsider. She had done it. She had made it to the life I had dreamed of for her. And now, I wasn't sure where I fit in. After the ceremony, we went out for dinner at a nice restaurant she had picked. She ordered a glass of wine and talked about her plans for the future, a new job in the city, an apartment with a view, endless possibilities. Mom, she said, her voice soft, you don't have to keep working at the diner. You can take some time for yourself now. I didn't know what to say. For years, my life had revolved around her. Every decision I made, every hour I worked, had been for her. Now, she was telling me to stop, to let go, but who was I without her? Longer how many times I crunched them. I felt a familiar wave of panic rising, but I pushed it down. MIA came home that evening, her face glowing with excitement about some program the college offered. I didn't have the heart to tell her how bad things looked. I just nodded, smiled, and said, we'll figure it out. And we did, somehow. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, covering for anyone who called out sick. I cleaned houses on my days off and even sold some of the few pieces of jewelry my mother had left me. MIA applied for every scholarship she could find, worked a part-time job on campus, and took out loans I prayed she wouldn't regret someday. Between the two of us, we made it happen, but the cost wasn't just financial. It was emotional, too. In the months after she left for college, the house felt empty in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'd grown so used to her chatter filling the evenings, her stories about school, her laughter over some silly video she'd found online. Now it was just silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the floorboards. I kept telling myself that this was what I had worked for, that this loneliness was proof I had succeeded as a mother. But late at night, when I was too tired to sleep but too restless to do anything else, I'd sit at the kitchen table and wonder, who was I now? Without MIA to take care of? She came home for Thanksgiving that first year, and I couldn't stop smiling the entire week. I made all her favorite dishes, even though it meant staying up half the night baking pies after my shifts. She looked older, more polished somehow, like she was already becoming the kind of woman I'd always dreamed she'd be. But something was different. She seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, talking about friends I didn't know and places I'd never been. I listened, nodding and smiling like always. But there was a distance between us I couldn't quite bridge. When she left to go back to school, I stood at the window and watched her drive away, feeling a hollow ache I couldn't explain. The years passed, and the distance grew. MIA was busy with classes, internships, and her growing social circle. Our phone calls became shorter and less frequent, filled with updates that felt more like summaries than real conversations. I told myself it was normal, that she was just finding her independence. But sometimes, I'd catch myself staring at my phone, willing it to ring, only to be met with silence. One time, I surprised her by visiting campus. I thought it would be a treat, a chance to reconnect, but when I got there, she seemed embarrassed. She introduced me to her friends, but I could tell she was nervous, almost apologetic. They were all so polished, so confident, and there I was, in my thrift store sweater and scuffed shoes, a reminder of the life she was trying to leave behind. After that visit, I stopped showing up unannounced. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, even if it meant seeing her less. By her junior year, I had stopped asking for much of her time. She was busy, and I understood that, but it still stung when I'd call and get her voicemail or when her texts became curt and sporadic. I threw myself into work, picking up even more shifts to distract myself. The diner became my entire world, a bubble where I could lose myself in the rhythm of pouring coffee and clearing plates. The regulars noticed the change. "You okay, Hon?" one of them asked one day as I refilled his mug. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. How could I explain that the thing I'd worked so hard for me as independence felt like a punishment now that I had it? When MIA graduated college, I sat in the audience just like I had at her high school graduation. She looked radiant, her cap and gown crisp and new, her smile as dazzling as ever. I cheered louder than anyone when her name was called. But this time, the pride was mixed with something else, something heavier. After the ceremony, we went out to dinner at a restaurant far fancier than I was used to. Mia's treat. She looked so poised, so confident, talking about her plans for the future, the job offer she'd accepted, the city she'd be moving to. I smiled and nodded, as always, but inside, I felt like I was watching her drift further and further away. The day she left for her new job, MIA sat me down at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd spent years figuring out how to make ends meet for her. She looked at me with a mix of love and determination. and said, "Mom, it's time for you to stop working so hard. You've done enough. You should think about moving somewhere new, doing something just for you." I stared at her, not sure how to respond. I knew she meant well, but the words felt like a slap. I'd built my entire life around taking care of her, working for her, sacrificing for her, and now she was asking me to let it all go. To let her go, to let myself go. "Okay," I said finally, forcing a smile, but inside, I was crumbling. MIA didn't waste any time settling into her new life. She moved to the city, found an apartment with tall windows and modern furniture, and started her job. She sent me photos of her office, her new friends, even the view from her balcony. Every snapshot was a glimpse into a world I didn't recognize, a life so far removed from the one we'd shared. I tried to be happy for her, and in some ways, I was, but the quiet of the house after she left was deafening. The kitchen table where we used to sit and talk over dinner felt like a relic of another time. Her bedroom, now empty except for a few forgotten knickknacks, was a reminder of how much things had changed. One evening, I sat on her bed and picked up a stuffed animal she'd left behind. One she hadn't touched in years. It smelled faintly of her, a mix of lavender and something uniquely MIA. I held it close, tears spilling over before I could stop them. I felt ridiculous, mourning something I'd worked so hard to make happen. I'd raised her to be independent, to chase her dreams, and she had, but I hadn't prepared myself for what that would mean for the space she'd leave behind. I tried to take her advice, though, I really did. I started looking for something new, a fresh start. I applied for retail jobs, cashier positions, even office assistant roles, but every time I sat in an interview, I felt like I was faking it. What did I know about anything other than waiting tables? My hands, rough from years of dish soap and cleaning grease, didn't fit the polished world I was trying to enter. Eventually, I found a small retail job in another town, about an hour away from where MIA and I had lived. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a change. I rented a modest apartment on the edge of town, a little one-bedroom with beige walls and a leaky faucet. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Packing up the house was harder than I thought it would be. Every drawer I opened was filled with memories, Mia's old report cards, her crayon drawings, the postcards we used to collect from road trips. I wanted to keep everything, but I knew I couldn't. I boxed up the essentials and donated the rest, though I kept a few of her drawings tucked away in an old shoebox. When the day came to leave, I stood in the doorway and looked around one last time. The house was empty, stripped of the life we'd built there. I set the keys on the counter and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. My new life started slowly. The retail job kept me busy, but it wasn't the same as the diner. There were no regulars to joke with, no familiar faces to brighten my day. My coworkers were polite but distant, and I often ate lunch alone in the break room. Still, it was something to fill the hours, and I needed that. In the evenings, I'd sit in my little apartment and wonder what to do with myself. I wasn't used to having so much free time. At first, I tried watching TV, but the silence of the empty room was too much. So, I started writing in a journal, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. At first, the words came slowly, but eventually, they poured out of me, memories of raising MIA. The struggles of the diner, my fears, my hopes, my regrets. It felt strange to write about myself after all these years. I'd spent so long focusing on MIA, on her needs and her future, that I'd forgotten how to think about my own. But the more I wrote, the more I realized how much I had buried. Dreams I'd once had, places I'd wanted to go, things I'd wanted to do. One day, I went for a walk and stumbled upon a community garden. It was a small, unassuming space, tucked between two buildings, but something about it caught my attention. The air smelled of soil and blooming flowers, and I could hear the soft hum of bees. I didn't know much about gardening, but I signed up for a plot anyway. Working in that garden became my sanctuary. There was something therapeutic about digging in the dirt, planting seeds, and watching them grow. It gave me a sense of purpose, something to look forward to. I started spending hours there, tending to my little patch of vegetables and flowers. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something just for me. I also made a friend, Margaret, an older woman with a sharp wit and a kind heart. She lived in the apartment across the hall and had been gardening for decades. She taught me the difference between annuals and perennials, how to tell when tomatoes were ready to pick, and the importance of mulching. Margaret had her own stories of loss and reinvention. And in her, I found someone who understood what it meant to start over. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find small joys in my new life. I volunteered at a local food bank on weekends, went to the library to check out books, and even took a watercolor painting class at the community center. I wasn't very good at it, but it didn't matter. It felt good to create something, even if it was just for me. Mia called occasionally, her voice bright and full of excitement about her job and her life in the city. She told me about the projects she was working on, the places she'd visited, the new friends she'd made. I listened, smiling through the phone, happy to hear her so fulfilled, but I didn't tell her much about my own life, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to explain this quiet, slow rediscovery of myself. One day, while flipping through my journal, I found a list I had written when I was a teenager. It was a list of dreams, things I wanted to do someday: travel to the Grand Canyon, learn how to bake a pie from scratch, see a Broadway show. Most of them were small, ordinary things, but they felt monumental to me. I had forgotten about them entirely. I decided to start crossing them off. The first item I decided to tackle from my old list was baking a pie. It seemed simple enough, though I quickly learned it wasn't as easy as I'd imagined. My first attempt was a disaster. The crust was too tough, the filling too watery, and my smoke alarm got a workout. But I didn't give up. I spent a week scouring cookbooks and watching videos online. By my fourth try, I finally got it right: a golden, flaky crust and a warm apple filling that made the entire apartment smell like a country kitchen. I sat at the kitchen table, eating a slice of my homemade pie, and felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride in myself. It was a small victory, but it was mine. I took a picture and sent it to Mia. She replied with a row of exclamation points and a heart emoji, her enthusiasm making me smile. The next item on my list was bigger: visiting the Grand Canyon. It felt impossible at first. A trip like that wasn't something I'd ever allowed myself to consider. But with Margaret's encouragement, I started saving a little from each paycheck. By the end of the summer, I had enough to book a cheap bus ticket and a few nights at a budget lodge near the canyon. The trip was a revelation. Standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, with its vast, layered cliffs stretching out to the horizon, I felt small but not insignificant. The wind whipped my hair as I stood there, and for the first time in years, I felt free, free from the weight of the past, free from the expectations I'd placed on myself. I spent hours walking along the rim, taking in the sights and journaling about the experience. I thought about Mia, how much she'd love this place, and decided I'd bring her here someday. But for now, it was just for me. With each small adventure, I felt pieces of myself coming back together. I started attending local events, a poetry reading at the library, a flea market in the town square, even a jazz concert at a nearby park. I said yes to things I would have avoided before, like joining a book club or taking a pottery class. My days no longer felt like something to endure but something to savor. Mia's calls became less frequent, but when they did come, they were filled with stories of her own adventures. She was thriving in her job, exploring the city, and building a life she loved. It made me proud, even if a part of me still missed her deeply. I didn't tell her much about my own small victories. It didn't seem important to her. But I kept a running list in my journal, a record of all the ways I was slowly rebuilding myself. One afternoon, I received a letter from Betty, my old boss at the diner. She was retiring and wanted to let me know how much she appreciated my years of service. She enclosed a photo of the diner, now under new ownership, and a handwritten note: "You were one of the best, Laura. I hope you're doing something for yourself now. You deserve it." I stared at the photo for a long time. The diner had been my life for so many years, a place of routine and struggle but also of connection and growth. I hadn't been back since I left, but suddenly, I felt a pull to see it one more time. A few weeks later, I made the drive back to my old town. The diner looked mostly the same, though the sign had been updated, and the neon, open, light finally worked without flickering. I parked in the lot and hesitated for a moment, wondering if I'd even recognize anyone inside, but then I took a deep breath and walked in. The smell of coffee and fried onions hit me immediately, transporting me back to those long, grueling shifts. A young waitress greeted me with a cheerful smile, her ponytail bouncing as she led me to a booth. I sat down and looked around, memories flooding back. The faces were different, but the atmosphere was the same: warm, bustling, and alive. I ordered a cup of coffee and sat there for a while, watching the waitress dart between tables with a practiced ease. She reminded me of myself years ago, balancing plates and dreams. Before I left, I handed her a generous tip and said, "You're doing great." She looked at me, surprised, and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. As I walked out of the diner, I felt a sense of closure. That part of my life was behind me, but it had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Back at home, I flipped to the final page of my journal. The list of dreams I'd started as a teenager was almost complete. There were a few items left, but I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had time to explore, to rest, to simply be. I wrote one last entry, the words flowing easily. I thought my life ended when MIA left, but it didn't. It was just beginning. The sacrifices I made weren't the end of me. They were the foundation for something new. I am more than a mother, more than a waitress, more than the sum of my struggles. I am a woman learning to live again, and that is enough. I closed the journal and set it aside, smiling to myself. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was a blank page, waiting for me to write the next chapter. And for the first time, I couldn't wait to see what it would be. Life didn't magically transform into something extraordinary after that trip to the diner. I still had my quiet nights, my moments of wondering if I'd done enough, and the occasional pang of loneliness. But those feelings didn't consume me like they used to. Slowly, I was learning to make space for both the sorrow of what I'd let go and the joy of what lay ahead. MIA called one Sunday afternoon, her voice as bright as I remembered. She wanted to visit for a weekend, just the two of us. It had been months since we'd seen each other, and the thought of her coming to my little apartment both thrilled and terrified me. It wasn't the home she'd grown up in, and I worried it wouldn't feel like enough. But when she arrived, she bounded through the door with the same enthusiasm she'd had as a child, hugging me tightly before looking around. "This is cute, Mom," she said, spinning in a slow circle to take it all in. "I love it. It feels cozy." Her words eased a tension I hadn't realized I was holding. We spent the weekend cooking together, walking around town, and catching up. She talked about her job and the new challenges she was facing. But she also asked about my life, really asked. For the first time in a long time. "What have you been up to, Mom?" she said one evening as we sat on the couch with cups of tea. "You've been so quiet about your own life." I hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything I'd been doing. But then I told her about the garden, the trips I'd taken, the classes I was trying. Her eyes widened with each new detail. And by the end, she was grinning. "That's amazing," she said, squeezing my hand. "I'm so proud of you." Her visit was a turning point for us. After she left, we started talking more often, and our conversations felt different, more balanced, more open. I stopped worrying so much about whether I was saying the right thing or trying to hide my struggles. Instead, I let her see me as I was, not just her mother, but a person still figuring things out. The next time I visited her in the city, she took me to all her favorite spots, a cozy bookstore, a bustling farmer's market, and a tiny cafe where she ordered a latte with far too many words in it for me to remember. We laughed over pastries, reminiscing about the simpler days when a $2 slice of pie at the diner was the height of indulgence. At one point, she looked at me, her expression soft. "You know," she said, "everything I've accomplished, everything I am, it's because of you. You gave me everything, Mom, and I hope you know that I don't take it for granted." Her words stayed with me long after I returned home. For years, I had worried that MIA didn't understand the sacrifices I'd made, that she didn't see how much I'd given up for her. But now I realized that she did see it. And more importantly, she appreciated it. I continued working through my list of dreams. Some were small, like learning how to make pasta from scratch or trying yoga. Others were bigger, like planning a trip to New York City to finally see a Broadway show. Margaret, my neighbor, came with me for that one, and we spent the weekend marveling at the lights and energy of the city. The show was breathtaking, and as the curtain fell, I found myself wiping away tears, not of sadness, but of pure, unfiltered joy. By the time I reached the last item on the list, write my story, I realized I already had. My journal, now filled with entries spanning the past few years, was the story I'd been waiting to tell. It wasn't a story of perfection or ease, but one of resilience, love, and growth. And that was enough. MIA visited again for the holidays. And this time, she brought someone with her, a kind, soft-spoken man named Andrew. He was nervous, stumbling over his words as he shook my hand, but I could see how much he cared for her. Watching them together, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the days when Mia's world revolved around me. But it was a good kind of ache. The kind that reminded me of how far we'd both come. As we sat around my tiny table, eating the pie I'd baked from scratch, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of completeness. My life wasn't grand or glamorous, but it was mine, and it was full of love in all its forms. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone in my apartment, a glass of wine in hand and my journal open in front of me. I thought about the past year, the risks I'd taken, the dreams I'd chased, and the woman I was becoming. For the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to myself. When the clock struck midnight, I whispered a quiet resolution into the stillness, keep going. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for life to happen, I was living it, and that, I realized, was the greatest dream of all.